Gotcha.
So good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see we have a few people here on a nice Friday afternoon, ready to learn how to DM or at least share thoughts on how to get started. So this is the first DM workshop that we're doing in the spring semester for D&D at IU. And the idea behind these DM workshops are not so that we have there's not to teach you a right way to DM, but we're going to share ideas with each other and have a discussion about a certain topic or a certain list of topics whenever we do a DM workshop, and kind of come to some, share some tips and tricks and ideas together about how to do our job best as DMs. And today's topic is going to be about getting started. So it's especially useful for people who haven't DM'd yet or are interested in just trying to get started learning how to DM, or still have questions about things that maybe they still have a few sticking points. Maybe you've already started and are just looking for more tips and tricks, or maybe you're like me, who's been DMing for a long time, but still you're sure that you're going to learn something when you're around a bunch of DMs from D&D at IU. So that's the topic of today. It's just going to be about getting started. Um, and I also am going to start this conversation with my intro story, and then we'll kind of open the floor and start having a bit more of a discussion. So I wish I had some sort of documentation to share my screen about, to start with my intro story. Perhaps I could find the map that we used, but I had been a player at D&D for like 3 or 4 sessions when I knew that there was an idea that I wanted to run. Now, I'd never DM'd before, never knew how to do it, but a lot of people say that the best way to learn is through trial by fire. So anyway, I decided to start taking notes about this idea that I wanted to run. The idea was essentially a trial in some sort of hallucination by any sort of player character, as a villain tried to make them succumb to their temptations in a dream. Um, so of course, one crazy thing would happen, and then things would phase in and out, and the next crazy thing would happen, and hopefully they can hang on to their personality throughout the entire sequence of events. So I started writing about what events would happen, come up with a funny joke, come up with a few characters, and those will stick around for the entire duration of the story, of the story that follows. The the key to what I was thinking about was not that I wanted there to be a certain number of combat encounters and a certain number of puzzles and a certain number of social encounters and a certain set amount of adventure. I was starting with this idea and going from there. It seems like the rest of it sort of happened on its own. So sure enough, I finished up the idea. The module is called Zarim's Trial now. I ran it with a friend. I ran it with my brother, and then I'd run it with an entire group. And then now it's just something I have in my back pocket. So I was able to start by developing this idea and starting with this idea driven, I want to run this. And then whenever I have a question, how do I want to run that? I would be able to look into the literature on the topic and go from there. So that's my origin story on how I started becoming a DM. And you know, we've compiled a list, thanks to Tyler, and Tyler can share more about it, of some reading that can help you if you also want to figure out, some general things of what you want to do as a DM, or you have an idea what are the rules for that. But I wanted to share that as my origin story. And then if anyone has questions or anything to add to the discussion, you can say that now, or we can just talk about some other stuff. That's the intro.
Yeah, so I want to also kind of like add on to on the beginning here is that I have been compiling like a sort of reading list or like a list of like some basic topics that are really important to like being a DM, and and some of these could be like with textbooks, or they could just be the like just like or like a video itself, like a website. But I think the key important thing here, like you mentioned, is like when you come to D&D, like either when you're brand new or because you're a player, that like there's 3 giant books. Like there's like Monster Manual, There's like player's handbook. There's like the DM's guide. I don't know. I don't think I'm like alone when I say this, that most DMs probably haven't read every single page of this book and would highly recommend that you don't do it. There's a lot of really good, useful chunks where they can be useful at different times, but they're really just there as like, filler or just helping you when you're running the game or just trying to understand the game in a different way. But that being said, there are a couple of areas that at least we thought would be helpful for like if you are going to DM. These are kind of like the basics that would probably help you starting out because all the rules here are just guidelines. So it's just a role playing game, and they're really just to help you run the game, but it's not a be all end all like to how you're going to run it. So you could completely ignore all these rules too. But so in this specific guide, we're thinking like would be good to read a couple of these pages here for the player's handbook. There's some from like the Dungeon Master's Guide, and I'll show this reading list later. But a couple things to think about like when you're being a DM is just first of all just knowing what D&D is. So the idea of like that you're in this sort of fantasy type of environment, with heroes like going on adventures. So another thing could just be understanding like what is the cornerstone of like being a DM. Could be taking play styles into account. So like like do you think you want to play a game with lots of like stealth? There's going to be like high action, or there's going to be like some social intrigue and like political things going on there. You also want to consider like the tiers of play, which oftentimes are separated by like levels. So, so like when your characters are like level 1 to 6, like they're kind of more so maybe solving like a crime like a bandit in a town, or like if they're a little bit higher on, maybe they're in like helping a kingdom, and all the way up to like level 20, which is where you could be just fighting gods basically. So like it's important to know that, especially, or to kind of decide that before you start your games, to kind of understand like how you want the experience to go. And with that also goes like the sort of flavors of fantasy. So do you want it to be like kind of silly, or do you want it to be something more serious? Do you want it to be about something more dark fantasy and scary, or do you want it to be like really like high fantasy and high magic, where you're kind of like the Avengers essentially? And so there's a couple other things you can learn like here from like Dungeon Master's Guide about like the sort of the core rules from like, the DM's point of view. Understanding like table etiquette, so like what's okay and not okay, and like sort of the expectations of players and DMs. Um, and some other basic things as far as we'll get into here is like the sort of 3 pillars, like they call like a D&D, which we'll talk about down in later. But I think, or we've been thinking like one of the important things to also talk about here is like ability scores. And would you like to talk about that a little bit, Danny?
Yeah, and a lot of times ability scores, a lot of players like to think that ability scores define their character, which is true to some degree. I think that ability scores are the key to taking D&D from an entirely luck-based game to a mostly luck-based game. The point of ability score is mainly being to add to rolls, and we're looking through this entire this entire list of reading, like recommended reading for DMs. But I would say that the ability scores part of reading, I would put a star on that. I'd put a star on the ability scores reading as one of the main ones you want to look at. You don't really necessarily need to read a lot of the stuff in the Dungeon Master's Guide to be a Dungeon Master, but you better know the stuff your players need to know too. So ability score is really important.
Yeah, ability scores is one of the most common things you're going to be like seeing in D&D. Is there are a lot of these like ability checks where like someone's going to try to jump across a pit and like have to make an athletics check, or trying to like sneak into a room and like make a stealth check. And it's I would say this is probably one of the most important concepts to hone in on understanding as far as role playing, and getting to see like if somebody is successful in doing something like or not. And so that would be a very important thing to check on. But another thing that we were just talking about earlier with these sort of like pillars of D&D, that there's the understanding that there's like combat encounters, so like just straight up like fighting people. there's like more social, where you're interacting with NPCs, with like other players, and there's more exploration. So you could be like searching for a treasure chest or like the key to like the next door, basically. It's good to be able to also like look into some of the differences between those, and maybe what your players are feeling like they're more excited to actually like encounter or to come across. Like I know one campaign I've heard of is entirely focused like around combat, but maybe some of your players are more excited by like getting to like discover and explore things like throughout their environment that they're doing there.
Yeah, I would
But yeah,
second
and
that.
so
It's a the entire point of D&D is telling a story, and you as the DM are providing the world for that story, and you get to watch your players, walk through and explore your world. So it's also just important to know what your players want, and just knowing kind of the three pillars is a great way to start. Most of the time, what a player is going to want is going to involve one of those three, either combat, social, or exploration.
yeah, so also a little cool thing about this too is that if you've been a player before in D&D, then a lot of this stuff is probably going to be like obvious to you, or at least you'll have like some sort of basic understanding of it, which will really take down like the amount of like entry like into being a DM. And there's a surprisingly low like skill floor for actually becoming a DM than you might seem at first. So, like you'll see people that have been DMing for a while, and they have these like magnificent, really interesting campaigns, but a lot of it really does just take practice as well and trying to find like what makes it fun for you as far as running the game. But it's another one of those things that is important is like spell casting. Like there's a lot of magic in D&D and spells that can like do different things, and some of them that could be have minor effects, and some that can completely turn a game around, like the wish spell. So you don't necessarily have to know all of the spells. It's good to sort of have experience with understanding most of the time, and you can kind of skim through the spells, the like regular spell list if you want to sometime. And there's a sort of almost like social contract between like you and the player, where like the player's using a spell that you don't know that you kind of expected to doing it the right way, but it's good to just make sure that you as the sort of facilitator of this game are making sure that like spells are happening the right way, at least that they are intended to be cast, and also just to be okay with like a little bit of leeway if your players have a creative idea on how to use the spell, that maybe you can go along with it just to add to the story. Um, and another thing that we can talk about here too is just defining the difference between like a campaign and a one shot. So like it'd be good to know early on whether like you want to run like a single game, maybe it's like a sort of movie length experience, or you want to run something that could be a couple sessions, like maybe over a month, a couple months, or even a year, or multiple years. Um, Danny, do you have anything to add on that?
I think that it's also important to note that you don't necessarily have to commit to running a campaign, because if you start on a one shot, a campaign can happen if your players are just that interested.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. Sometimes some great campaigns can start from one shots. Like a one shot goes really, really well, and it can be a low commitment for some of the players that are there, and then they decide like, hey, this is actually really fun. I want to stay with this group and I want to keep playing. So let's go ahead and do a campaign together. So sometimes it can happen dynamically like that, and not all campaigns do have to finish, or necessarily do. At least from my experience, it's very common that campaigns do stop at some point, but it's all up to you guys as far as how much you want to play. And when you are DMing, you can create something entirely by yourself, or there are pre-written adventures that are written by just fans, or like other companies, or even just Wizards of the Coast themselves. That can help you to create like hooks to your story, or just the general outline of the story for you if you want. So there are some options there, depending on how much work you want to put into building this world and helping your players to craft the story. Yeah. So, Danny, would you like to talk about what happens when things go wrong?
Which is kind of most of the time. Um, so I think that this is going to be the question that most of the DMs, like most people who are curious about DMing, are always going to have, and that's just that, you think that there's going to be a prescribed solution to every issue, and that DMing sort of goes by the book. And as it turns out, that's not quite as much the case as you might have initially thought, because a lot of the process of DMing is learning what your players are after and then trying to make sure that that portion of the world is ready for them when they arrive. And sometimes, players and the DM sort of have this unspoken handshake that the players are going to kind of sniff where the DM wants them to go and go there. But a lot of the times that doesn't happen. And sometimes players will intentionally not go where you want them to go. Now, those are the horses that you can't even lead to water. But the point being that as a DM, it's up to you. The onus is on you to figure out what happens. And thankfully, you don't always need a book to figure out what happens when your players try to charm a beholder, right? There's not really a rule book for making like a romance check on a beholder or something like that, because that's not something that's not an eventuality that Gary Gygax foresaw, and that's the entire point of D&D. It's to have those eventualities in there, and it's up to you as a DM to decide whether or not that player is doing something incredibly stupid and is going to get vaporized. Because of course, if that's the type of game that you're running and that's not going to work, that's not going to work. Or maybe is it some sort of role that involves a performance check. It's up to you to decide what happens. And a lot of times you'll find that there's a lot of really easy ways to give your players to prepare the world for your players when they walk a path that you have not prepared yet.
Yeah, so and kind of on that, the really beautiful thing about D&D and just role playing games in general is that like this is not a book where it's a passive experience, and it's not necessarily like video games where there are a certain number of finite outcomes that can happen. It's a role playing game where you're using your imagination so that you're really giving your players like agency to make it feel like they can do kind of whatever they want. I mean, like within certain boundaries of rules, of course, unless you're in certain campaigns where you're in the astral plane, you can do whatever you want. But that is a really amazing thing, and I think brings us a lot like back to D&D is the fact that you have so much choice and so many things that can happen in there. And so with that kind of choice, like you may have a couple of general like plot directions or things that you want to accomplish, but it's good to be able to like to do some improv to go along with what ideas players may have, and we can do a whole DM workshop on just improv by itself because it's a really important topic in D&D. But that's one of the great things to appreciate as well, especially like if it doesn't sound like an impossible idea, especially for the players, sometimes it's good to just simply go along with that because it just makes the game more fun. And it is a game that revolves around your imagination.
That's right. And I know Jacob ran a campaign once upon a time in the astral plane, which is all about the imagination. Is that right?
So the idea of that campaign, it started off with a single session from a different one, where the actual plane, according to the player's handbook, like in the actual thing, is that gravity is subjective there, so people can just kind of fly around. And I just took it much farther and said everything is subjective there. And so I ended up creating an entire campaign just based around like if you can convince yourself that something's true, it's going to happen. And so my players caused all sorts of chaos, added teeth to everything, deleted bones from people, repeatedly yeeted people just out of existence. And it was one of the most fun times I ever had because the entire point of it was just cause chaos, have people's craziest ideas come out. And it was a great break from my more serious campaign that I usually run in the summers. So it all depends on not only like what are you doing as a DM, because I run both of those styles of campaigns and I love both of them, but also like the group of people you're playing with and what it is they want to do. Because some of the players from my astral plane shenanigans, as I called it, I would never have play in my summer campaign, and vice versa, because they're just not the same kind of players. And that's where a lot of that skill of starting to read your players comes in.
Yeah, so campaigns can have like a lot of different styles for sure, like in that. And so that's always a good thing to be talking about, especially before you start with campaigns or games, is to like see what people are interested in, kind of how they want to play a game. I mean, similar to any other like experience, really, just like media in general. Like if you like reading a certain kind of book, or like you like watching certain kinds of movies, and even ratings are a big thing too. Especially if you go into like really serious topics, like it's gonna be really good to go ahead of time to make sure that those players you're with can be okay with certain serious topics. Or if there's some that you're saying, I'm going to have these completely off the table, and that's where you have like a lot of creativity with those players to kind of decide what kind of experience you want to have. Like my game specifically is very serious. It's actually like a dark fantasy game set in this setting called like Grim Hollow. It was like a Kickstarter project a while back, but it's very very dark. Like it's very dangerous. There's monsters everywhere. It's very much like a rated R movie. And the nice thing too is that we do have like moments of like lightheartedness and jokes here and there to kind of make sure that it doesn't stay completely in the dark and just make people sad. But that's something that we really enjoy, and we really enjoy making it really gritty and tough. There's extra rules for like if you get to 0 health points, you get like really badly wounded. So there you can definitely see, like compared to like the astral plane campaign, that there could be totally different styles of campaigns you want to run, like if you want to be able to do that. I'm in another campaign actually right now where it's essentially like an arena style thing where you're fighting like gods, like based off of the game Hades, like that recently came out. And so it's a lot more like an arena style, like battle it out kind of thing. But you get all these special magic items, and you kind of feel like superheroes in a way. So it's kind of like you have a lot of choice and leeway to try like all sorts of different things.
I mean, we've just been bouncing off stories of different ones that we've run up here. But to me, one of my biggest things is find a story you're passionate to tell.
Yeah, where's all about the idea?
Like Danny's Galt story about the werewolves and multiple moons and stuff is something that he runs super well. And I believe you worked with your brother on that one too.
That's right, yeah.
Like there's something, I play through it and I can see the passion and all the different ideas he's had about it. But it's not something I personally would ever run, because to me it's grittier and tougher than I usually am on my players. And so you just have to, once
your character died, that's why.
No, I was happy about that. I'm usually not a very killing DM myself. But when you get that idea that you go like, I want to see how this story gets told, like, and you start having just more and more ideas come, that's the one that you latch onto and you say, let's see where this goes. And even if it's just, we're going to do a one shot and see if people latch on as well, that's what you got to do. Finding the passion behind, it's a game. So if you're not enjoying it or being passionate about it, then it's not the right one. And never be afraid to just talk openly with your players and say like, hey, as a DM, I'm not feeling this campaign or something. I'm burnt out in real life, whatever. Because if you aren't enjoying it, I can guarantee the players aren't either. And that's not like you did something wrong. Like that's just how life goes. People shift. There's everything going on in life.
Yeah, preparation could be a big thing too, like especially in DMing, and like finding with preparation that it is also a part of your experience as a DM, like before you prepare for every game. So sometimes you like to just completely think of an idea in your head in the shower, and then like in about 30 minutes, and then you're done. You're all set for the game. or you like to write really nice notes out like for a couple hours or so. And oftentimes, at least I've heard of stories, even myself, this has happened where like your first session might have a lot more notes than usual. And maybe you'll write less notes over time. It's just kind of however you feel comfortable with it. But the preparation does also have to feel fun for you. So, whatever way you do it that makes it feel less like a chore, you can do that. So, like, for example, I actually like to build some really detailed maps. A lot of people may not like to do that. Some people do, some people don't. Like, I like to just completely like map out like different insides of the areas of buildings because it adds a little bit more detail sometimes than what I feel like I could describe as a DM. And I'm not sure if that's because I'm just bad at describing things, or if that's just because there are little details here and there, like in the rooms that I may not have thought of, where some people can interact with it. Like one of the pirate players actually in our group saw it as like a window curtain and decided to climb up on a rope and jump off of it, doing a 360 with his rifle and just shoot at someone like during combat. Or someone at one point went to look at a carpet that was in the room and just thought like maybe there's something hidden under here, and ended up cutting under it. And sure enough, like there was a casket for a vampire down there. So that is one really thing like that is nice about maps that you can do if you want to make them. Or you can simply just make a bunch of rectangles and just use theater of the mind to sort of describe things, and like have a description set out like that if you want to. Because if making those things isn't fun for you, you don't necessarily have to do it. But it's more so up to you. And I think after DMing like a couple sessions, you'll start to figure out some things like that over time, and maybe like even after more than a couple sessions, you can figure out like what can be fun for you in that sense too. But the best part, kind of like Danny was saying, is just trying things, really, just seeing like what's fun for you and like what makes that experience better.
Yep, absolutely. And it all, like we kind of agreed on, it starts with an idea. Now, we haven't invited, for people that are watching on YouTube, we won't be able to invite you to talk because it'll be uploaded after the fact. But for the others here, if you have an idea you'd like to share that you have that maybe you're about to get into DMing about, we'd love to hear it.
Or even just what got you into DMing, or like what got you excited about it in the first place.
Because we only have a few minutes left here, so want to give everyone a chance to talk if they want to.
Another thing too is we can also reach out with comments on YouTube, like in the videos as well, and answer questions on there if anyone wants to.
Of course, yeah. But just if you have an idea that you're ready to take to the next level, when DM and tell the story and let the players interact with your idea, don't get married to the conclusion because it probably won't happen. But you start there, and if you're going to have questions about how you're going to run it, and if you can't answer those yourself, that's what the club's here for. So feel free to, if you're watching on YouTube, you can leave a comment. You can post something in the Dungeon Masters chat. If you don't have the Dungeon Masters role yet on Discord, you can message anybody in orange, and we will give it to you. So you'll always have the option to get started on that path.
Yeah, and now that I think we're coming to a conclusion with this session too, it'd be nice to see if anyone has suggestions for maybe the next DM workshop that we should do, or even if we should have other DMs to participate, like if there's certain topics that they want to be covering.
All right, I'm gonna personally suggest the improvisation one. We could do a whole DM workshop about that.
Sure.
If you have ideas, since we are kind of going to the whole deal with the YouTube thing, like and subscribe, by the way. Cough, cough.
Smash that like button.
Cast the fireball on the like button. Just leave something in the comments and we'll take a look at it, and we would love to do a new DM workshop on that topic. The discussion doesn't have to end here, but improvisation is one idea, and if anyone has other ideas, you can say them now or in the Discord chat.
I think that's. What were you gonna say, Jacob?
Yeah, I didn't want to hijack, but just going back to, I wanted to like have one last concluding thought myself. I was talking about like having your idea and be passionate about it. And I personally end up having like 1,000 different ideas that I love. Like that's how my brain works, and it's hard for me to pick one. You don't have to pick it. You just pick 5 ones you really like and just pitch them all to your players and have them pick the one that they enjoy the most. Great idea every time. It gets them involved not only from before they even start making a character, but you can also start involving them in world building at this point because you've only started thinking of these ideas. And so you can say like, okay, now tell me about your character. Let's see how they fit into the world as I craft it. And you can get a lot of really cool role play moments out of it that way.
Sure, for sure. Okay, well, I think that's the end of this session here. We can probably stop recording here.
All right. Thanks for watching on YouTube, and we'll see you at the next DM workshop.